I think they are characters. Hello, everybody. This is going to be another tag team point of view series of videos that I'm doing with my buddy Phil. This one is going to be, why does Marvel have such a tight hold on the comic book readership? Comic book fans. And I thought this was a really interesting video. I actually did something similar to this maybe about a year ago that I did on my own, and called more or less "Why is Marvel So Popular?" And I got a lot of great responses and everything. I thought it was, I really liked, the feedback I got from that one. So I was, really willing and eager to do another one, because I think the topic is really relevant still, especially with the whole DC relaunch coming out. Certain things are changing along with Marvel, you know what I mean? So, I was willing to do another one. It's a little bit tougher, just because I don't want to repeat myself too much. But I think some of the old issues, still, apply or whatever. But, please, let me know what you think, and let Phil know let him know what you think as well. My video is going to be first, and basically a lot of what I think of is same as what I thought as in the past. I think they were able to take over the market, back in the maybe 60s, 70s, early 80s. Just because at the time, back in those days, the characters were a bit more fresher. You had Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, then the guys after them, whether it was Jim Starlin, whether it was, I don't know, John Buscema, whether John Byrne, Frank Miller. I think they were able to come in with a fresh approach. One thing, the Marvel characters were still a little bit newer in compared to the DC characters. They hadn't been around quite as long, so they still seemed, fairly fresh. There still seemed like things you could do with them that you hadn't, seen over and over and over and over and over again yet. And plus, Marvel had, a different approach to storytelling. They had a different artistic approach, and I think it really caught the eye of a lot of different, a lot of the fans, a lot of the readers, DC characters. They're not just the characters, but just their method of storytelling, the type of things they did, seemed a little stiff in comparison, you know what I mean? You'd have the DC characters standing around trying to figure out, the puzzle of the purloined Picassos. Can you solve the mystery before the Flash does? And the Marvel comics, they're screaming at you at every cover. Every other cover had multiple explanation points. It was always a slugfest in the mighty Marvel manner. Face front, true believer. This one's got it all. All that sort of thing. And I think you also had at the time, I think, back in those days, they were willing to let certain artists and certain writers push things just a little bit farther. Now, I think that's how it was back then. I don't think that's how it is now, I don't think you can say, like, okay, the DC characters are all stiff and nobody has any flaws and they're all perfect and they're all bland, anymore, I think over the last, maybe 20 years ago, I think they've kind of caught up, to, what Marvel was doing back then and in a day, where you have, or even 20 years ago, whenever like Emerald Dawn came out, you were having like, Barry Allen Flash, or Barry Allen Flash. That's not what I meant to say. I meant to say Hal Jordan Green Lantern, they start slowly adding these layers to his backstory where, Hal was a cocky fighter pilot, or, who was also a womanizer, and he drove drunk and he liked to party and all this type of stuff. And now, even now, now that they've brought back Barry Allen Flash, the character that pretty much ushered in the Silver Age, they're adding his backstory. And forgive me if I get this wrong, just because I did not read Flash Rebirth, but I think they have the whole thing of now where Barry Allen's dad killed his mom, so now Barry Allen, kind of the most corniest, white bread hero of them all, he's got his tragic past, you know what I mean? And so, you can't say that there's that same sort of dichotomy between, the two sets of heroes or whatever. And, and of course, artists crossing over between each company, editors going back and forth, and all that sort of thing. I think there's a little bit more. I don't know if I want to quite say homogenous, but you can't look at it these days and go, there's a Marvel style and there's a definite DC style. I mean, I think they're a little bit closer to each other these days than they were before. The thing is, I think a lot of people still perceive the two companies in that way, you know what I mean? Even if you ask people who are like maybe more DC fans, they might like say, oh, yes, I like the DC characters more because, they're a little bit more wholesome, or these are the icon characters. Those characters over at Marvel, they're all the anti-hero characters, you know what I mean? And like for the examples I just gave before, I'm not sure that's uniformly true anymore. But I think people still think of them that way. I also think it's a case of Marvel Comics is actually the status quo. They're the company that everybody's heard of and everybody knows. And that, if somebody says something about, superheroes, Marvel Comics as a company, as a brand, is the first thing they think of. So maybe my kid wants to read some comic books, What are some comic books? Oh, get him some Marvel comic books. Okay. So you go to the store and you get some Marvel comic books because that's just what you've heard of, One thing that a lot of people wrote into me, last time was the whole idea of, a lot of cases you have, people who've been collecting comics for a while, and they might not even be into the new stories, or maybe they think the quality's dropped off, but it's like, wow, this is my favorite character, and I've got a complete run, and I don't want any gaps in my run, I don't want to miss out, So you just keep buying it and you hope it gets better. So that's another way they keep people going, And if it's somebody that's really popular, if it's Spider-Man or Wolverine or Deadpool, you might end up buying not just the main title, but the spin-off titles too, cause hey, you like Wolverine, you like Deadpool, so you get these other titles, even though it's extraneous. Well, at least you've got your collection there. You know what I mean? I also think, what else was I going to say? Just the thing, and just from like a marketing thing, and it's kind of a, I don't know what, I'm trying to think of a good word to use. Sometimes it's kind of a perplexing thing, or it's not perplexing, but it's kind of a troubling thing, because Marvel is more than willing to just flood the market with products sometimes, and you just know they have no intention of selling these comics. They're just there to be a physical thing, to just literally take up rack space, you know what I mean? There's only so much room on those racks in that store, and if they edge out the competition a little bit, then, they've done their job, even if you don't buy the comic book. One thing I can think of immediately, I'm in the store like a couple of weeks ago. Of course, they've got the Fear Itself event going on. Something that caught my eye was a comic book called, it was something like The Fearsome Four, or The Fearsome Foursome, or something like that. And it's a comic book starring She-Hulk, Man-Thing, and Howard the Duck, and Nighthawk. And the thing is, I like all those characters, but I'm like flipping it through, there's art by different artists, and it didn't seem to be about anything. They're not fighting the guys with the hammers, they're not interacting with the other superheroes. It's just, I don't know, this thing about some stuff, and they're just there. And I'm like, what's the purpose of this? This doesn't even tie into anything. Why is it here? It's there to take up space. I remember, I don't know if anybody remembers back when Identity Crisis was coming out in single issues. I went in the store one day, sitting right next to it is something called Identity Disc. And I don't know, Sabretooth or somebody like that was on the cover, and I don't even know what it was about. It had something to do with the Marvel villains doing some stuff or whatever. And, I did a double take, because I'm like, wait a minute. The thing I'm looking for is from DC, right? Yeah, you know what I mean? And, I didn't end up buying it or anything, but, it caused me to, I had to doubt myself for a minute, it confused me for like 2 seconds, and I think that was the whole point, if they put their thing out there, and even if you don't buy, that thing, if you know, don't see the comic book from some other company, you know, and maybe you leave out the store or whatever, maybe you haven't spent your money on that, you know, that Marvel comic, but if you don't spend it on another company's comic, then they've won, you know, then they still maintain their market share, even if they haven't, you know, got that, you know, $2 out of you or whatever, you know. And I think more and more they're, you know, willing to do that, you know. I think they're willing to do these stunts, you know, and stunts and gimmicks are cool, you know, but there's a limit to that. You could take it too far, you know. Every month you can't have the death of some character and, you know, have it in a black bag or whatever and expect it to sell like hotcakes. You can do that every once in a while, but you can't do that every month, you know what I mean? But, you know, they're more than willing to do that or take that risk, you know, just cause. And, you know, it's paid off for them more often than not. So, you know, that's why I guess they can justify doing it. But, you know, it keeps them in the news. It keeps their name out there. And the thing is, that's one thing that they haven't, let's see here. What's what I want to say. That's one thing that they're still able to do. Get their name out in the press, out in the public. If you go out there and ask random people in the street, Marvel Comics, you know, they know what you're talking about, whether they've read a comic book or not. If you say DC, they might have to think a bit. You might go, DC Comics? DC? What's that? You know, Superman? Oh, then they'll go, oh yeah, Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman. They know those characters, but they don't think of DC as a brand the way they think of Marvel as a brand. And I think that's all part of it as well. You know, for good or for bad, I think, you know, I think that's pretty much what it is. I think they're still going on the old reputation from like decades ago, you know, and, you know, maybe, I don't want to say ruthless business practices, you know, I don't know if I want to go that far, but, you know, you definitely have the stunts, the gimmicks. They know how to get, you know, the internet buzzing right now. And I think that keeps them, it keeps their name dominant in the market or whatever. Okay, so that's mine. You know, tell me what you think. You know, watch Phil's video. Tell him what you think. So far, I'm having fun with these tag team things. You know, let us know. Hey, if you want to do a video to respond to either of our videos, you know, please feel free. That's it. Thanks a lot, and you all have a good one.